Today, the results of the Wisconsin elections will be counted. Our next guest wrote about how those elections left a stain. Ah, I blew it. I'm doing it again. Hold on. They didn't lift a stain. They left a stain. They're just, oh, I'm terrified. Okay. Today, the results of the Wisconsin election will be counted. Our next guest wrote about how those elections left a stain on this country's so-called free and fair elections. The nation's John Nichols is a progressive powerhouse. In addition to the Wisconsin elections, John will talk about the conversations he has had with Bernie Sanders about the way this country has transformed with his presidential campaigns. John, thanks for joining us today.
It's really an honor to be with you, and I'm so glad you're doing what you're doing. At this moment, programs like this and all of the independent media that's going on around the country is really vital for keeping communications going.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate that. And we are hoping to support our progressive community as much as possible. Yeah, it's tough to watch the mainstream media and not feel completely isolated from your values. Mm-hmm. So with that said, let's just dive right in. Can you talk about, can you give us the 101 on how it is possible that Wisconsinites were forced to vote in person last week? Oh, John, I can't hear you.
It really was a remarkable. I'm sorry. I hope we can keep communication. Just tell me anytime you got a problem.
Okay, keep going.
Or I will, vice versa. But yeah, the storyline is an important one, and it's vital that we understand what happened in Wisconsin because it is so instructive for what could happen nationally. So we lay the groundwork there. In Wisconsin, about 2 weeks ago, it became absolutely clear that holding in-person voting would be a disastrous choice. And I emphasize the word choice. 15 states across the country that had primaries and state and local elections scheduled for this period have delayed them. They didn't cancel any elections. They postponed them to a point where it would be safer, or in some cases, they rearranged them and went to all mail voting, i.e. they just made sure that people didn't have to risk their health and safety to go and cast a ballot in person.
Not all mail, as in no girls are allowed to vote.
Yeah, every time I say it, I do think about that, and maybe we need another phrase, for how to do it. But we'll work on, I guess, all absentee balloting. But in truth, there's a subtle difference between absentee balloting and mail voting because mail voting gets a ballot to everybody, whereas absentee you have to request. But bottom line is that
vote by mail might help.
Yeah, vote by mail is great. Vote by male and female. So anyways, 2 weeks ago, it became absolutely clear that Wisconsin couldn't go ahead with in-person voting on April 7th. The orders were clear. They said people needed to shelter in place. And in some communities in Wisconsin, we have genuine hotspots. It's true that Wisconsin has many rural areas and many smaller cities where coronavirus is a reality and a challenge. But in our biggest city, Milwaukee, it's a very serious issue. And there have been a number of deaths. There's a number of cases. And so it was clear you just shouldn't go forward. The governor of the state, a Democrat, a very moderate Democrat, tried to work with the legislature. And the legislature is gerrymandered and controlled by Republicans. Remarkably, the Republicans in the legislature openly mocked him. I mean, literally ridiculed him for suggesting that the election, the in-person voting should be delayed or postponed. He finally pushed it to a point where he said, we have to have a special session of the legislature. He called it into order on the Saturday before the election. And they came, a couple of them came, gabbled it in and out of order in under 10 seconds. And then he called another special session. They gabbled that in and out of order in 10 seconds. And so it was this sort of disastrous situation where the governor was really trying to do, kind of mainstream cooperation politics. And the Republicans absolutely refused. So on the Monday before the election, the governor announced that he was going to do what every governor in other states like Wisconsin have done, including some Republican governors. He said, we're going to not have in-person voting on April 7th, but to make sure that no one is disenfranchised, we will extend absentee and mail voting until June 9th. And that fits with the pattern of what other states have done. He said all the votes that had already been cast by absentee will be counted. And then he set up a number of other protocols and offered to work with the legislature. So it was this very, very reasonable announcement. And I think even people that were very cynical about the Republicans assumed that they would swallow hard and accept this reality. They didn't. They sued in the state Supreme Court, which is a incredibly partisan, incredibly right-wing judicial activist court. And they got a ruling on a 4-2 majority to block what the governor had done and go ahead with the election. The Republicans also, and their allies, sued in the US Supreme Court. And amazingly enough, later that same afternoon, the day before the election, they got a ruling from the US Supreme Court that totally screwed up absentee voting in a way that guaranteed, for instance, that at least some immunocompromised people who had applied for absentee ballots would not get them in time to vote and would effectively be disenfranchised.
Wow.
For many, many other people, they created a situation where folks, in many cases who had applied for absentee ballots but not gotten them, had to make the hard choice of whether to stay at home for their own safety or go and vote.
What did the Supreme Court do exactly?
Sure. The US Supreme Court or the state.
Because this is, we're all afraid that the law of the land is, of course, once they set a precedent, we have an election in November. I don't think this pandemic's going to be completely cleared up by then.
That's exactly the right question. So you're talking about, remember, we had a state Supreme Court and a US Supreme Court, but you're talking about what the US Supreme Court did.
Right.
And that is dire, what they did. So here's the incredible thing. In the law, and I'm not going to give some big tutorial on the law, but essentially in the law, you have a couple of constructs that you go forward with. One is that you do try to follow the Constitution, try to follow the statutes, et cetera, et cetera. The other is that the law can adjust itself. It's a living reality. It can adjust itself to the moment, to the challenges of the moment. And so a US federal district judge in Wisconsin ruled that because of the chaotic circumstance, because of sheltering in place and many of the other challenges, and frankly, because of A, the confusion that already existed, and B, the urgency of the moment in which many people, more than 1 million, had applied for absentee ballots, thus creating chaos for clerks in counties and cities across the state. Because of these challenges, absentee voting would be extended. They extended the period for applying for an absentee ballot just a day, and then they extended the period for returning them a couple of days. It was just a very small practical change and a couple other shifts on how you do it. Amazingly enough, right-wingers sued about this. They went to the US Supreme Court, and the US Supreme Court came in 3 days, I'm going to make sure I count this off right, 3 days after the federal judge had issued his ruling setting the rules for absentee voting, and they threw those rules out. So as a result, people who had applied for absentee ballots, followed the rules, and done all the stuff they're supposed to do, didn't get those absentee ballots in time to vote. They would have gotten it under the federal judge's ruling, but because the Supreme Court basically limited and constrained absentee voting, they created a circumstance where, again, immunocompromised people who literally, for their health, could not go to vote in person, were left without an option. They were effectively disenfranchised by the US Supreme Court. Beyond that, just to do one final element, sorry, the court created such massive chaos that even today, 6 days after the election, we still are unclear about when exactly the ballots that will be counted when they'll be able to be counted, about how the count will go forward. And there's just going to be, I have to suggest, I think there's going to be dozens of lawsuits.
So what was at stake in this ballot? I mean, people know that there was primary voting, but what else was at stake?
A lot. It was a really big ballot, and Wisconsin has what's called spring elections. We've always had them. It's our tradition. They happen the first Tuesday in April, And
Try to
his,
get you out of your winter funk to come out.
yeah, I got to go do something. You know, it's up to 30 degrees. We're all wearing shorts and t-shirts, and you know, blah, blah, blah. And I'm not really kidding.
I know what you mean. I lived in Chicago for a while. It is
You get
so
the picture. Yeah, we're a hardy people.
Yes.
So the interesting dynamic is that the spring election is always a big deal. Now, every 4 years, you have a presidential primary or presidential
Oh,
primary.
oh, you're out, John.
People are on the ballot, but they're the
Can you repeat
operative
that, John? I'm
figures
sorry,
in this race.
you went out a
Yeah,
little bit. Can you repeat that?
of course.
Sorry.
There was a presidential primary, a Democratic presidential primary between Bernie Sanders and Joe Biden. And other candidates were on the ballot, but Sanders and Biden were the key figures. And here is the really interesting part about it. Wisconsin has a lot of Bernie Sanders backers. And so the presidential primary was consequential. There was a real test there. We don't know yet what the results will be, but I'm going to suggest to you that Biden probably will win, but Sanders will get a very strong number of votes, perhaps win a significant number of delegates. And so the presidential mattered. It was of consequence. But of far more consequence as regards, you know, the battles in the state was the race for state Supreme Court. We have a 7-member state Supreme Court. Conservatives control it, but the Supreme Court justice who was up was an appointee of Scott Walker, very controversial figure. And there was a very good chance that he would be beaten. I guess there still is a decent chance that he could be beaten, although it's been mangled now. And so that Supreme Court race.
What if the results turn out to be exactly what the Republicans wouldn't want? Because aren't the Republican voters sort of older and less likely to come out? I mean,
yeah,
you know,
Julianna, you're right. There is the romantic hope that those who endeavored to do the wrong thing are upended, and it could happen. But the important thing to understand is that the Republican legislators who acted on this wanted to race forward with an election that would have a low turnout. They knew that actually absentee balloting tends to attract more older voters, and it tends to attract more suburban voters. So their theory was that the absentee ballots that had already been cast were probably going to be beneficial to them. And so that's one of the reasons why they wanted it to go this way. They thought, and I think they may have been correct, we'll find out, that a limited in-person voting would reduce the possibility for mobilization, particularly in Milwaukee and some other cities where Democrats and progressives tend to do well. The important thing to understand, Julianna, is that the Supreme Court race is a quote unquote nonpartisan race. It's not really Democrats, Republicans, but it is liberal versus conservative. And so things tend to follow that pattern. And I'll just quickly also offer that Wisconsin elects pretty much all of its local offices, not all, but an overwhelming number of its local offices. So the mayor of Milwaukee was on the ballot, the county executive of Milwaukee County, and school boards, city councils, village boards, and town councils across the state. So when the state Supreme Court and the US Supreme Court mangled this process, they literally mangled thousands of contests.
Wow. What, and there's no results quite yet. We're waiting today to see if any results come through.
So this is the amazing thing. I know I don't want to get people lost in the chaos of our election, because it really was chaos. It's just an indefensible amount of it. But this is the fascinating reality. The US Supreme Court intervened to mess with absentee balloting, but they didn't know enough of what they were doing, right? So they set, there was one set of rules, and then there's another set of rules, and it is such chaos that even though the Supreme Court said ballots had to be marked by last Tuesday night, they didn't alter the rule that a federal judge had put down earlier for when they would be counted, which is this afternoon. Ooh. And so presumably, a lot of absentee ballots may even still be coming in today, some of which can be counted, some of which cannot. And here's where the chaos comes in. Absentee ballots that maybe somebody threw in the mailbox on Tuesday night in time for the election may not have gotten stamped till Wednesday. Those ballots won't be counted. In
Ah,
addition, I know. No, it
ah,
gets worse than that. It gets worse than that.
but
In
wait,
addition,
it's worse.
yeah, but wait, it's a whole lot worse because because we have attacked the postal service in the United States. It has been under assault for years.
That was one of our questions coming in from the chat.
Totally true. What's
Yeah.
happened is, if you will, the factories of the postal service are the mail sorting centers, and the factories of the postal service were moved. They shut them down in a lot of places, and so places like Madison used to have a mail sorting center. They don't have a mail sorting center here anymore.
Ooh.
And so ballots that are cast here have to go to Milwaukee and then come back. Ballots that are cast in Western Wisconsin have to go, I think over to Minneapolis and come back. It's like, it's this chaotic mess. And postal workers are frontline heroes in this struggle. And so are letter carriers.
Who's putting away the dishes?
Just a sec, Whitman, you got to stop.
Sorry.
They're hearing it on national TV. Sorry. This is my daughter who's doing exactly what she's supposed to do and is a great citizen. And by the way, hey, Whitman, can you come here a second?
Hi, girl.
This is Whitman, my daughter, who was a poll worker in the election.
Oh, thank you for risking your life.
Yeah.
Tell them what you wore.
I wore an N95 mask and gloves and stuff. We were pretty safe. We had big plexiglass shields in front of the tables. So.
I can't believe what this has come to. And thank you for doing that. I also understand part of the problem in Wisconsin is they closed down a whole bunch of voting places. So, because people who work the voting places are often older and they're at direct risk.
Whitman volunteered to step in as a 16-year-old. That's allowed in Wisconsin. And she started work at 1 p.m. on election day and didn't get back until 11 p.m.
Yeah. Thank you so much for doing that. I appreciate. Did you wash your hands when you got home?
I got right in the shower without touching anything.
Like, I know exactly what you mean.
And I think we burned her clothing.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for doing that. That was really interesting. That's great.
Thanks, Whitman.
Would you have done that if your dad wasn't John Nichols of the nation?
Oh, here.
Probably. My mom is pretty into.
Your mom is a better person than I will ever be. Yes. Whitman was a delegate to a state convention. She is a absolutely committed political person. She runs Human Rights Week at her school.
Yeah. Oh, that's fantastic.
She's way better than I am on so many levels.
Well, she is a woman. Sorry.
Absolutely, of course.
John, here's the question that came in from the stream chat from Shaggy Two-Fang.
Thanks, Whitman.
Oh, thanks, Whitman. I appreciate it. There's the question from our stream chat from Shaggy Two-Fang. Does your guest think that Trump refusing to fund the post office is an attempt to thwart mail-in voting in November?
Could be, and we shouldn't rule that out. Trump has been such a disaster on so many levels that it's hard to read his motivations. There are so many of them. And
does he have that kind of forethought? I mean, or is he just?
Yeah, he possibly does. Yeah. But here's, just to, and we'll tie this all together to complete the thought that we were talking about a moment ago. Postal workers, letter carriers, all these people, frontline workers are incredibly heroic figures. And they went out of their way to try and make sure that this chaotic Wisconsin process worked. However, they can't make things happen that are impossible. And so ballots did arrive late because of just the time and the challenges. In addition, there are a lot of ballots that didn't get postmarked. They were put into crates, they were sent, they were moved, but they didn't get postmarked. And if they don't have a postmark, there are people saying, even though they went through the process, we know that they were moved in the way they should be, that those ballots shouldn't be counted. And there's going to be incredible legal wrangling about this. So it's just a real chaotic mess all over the state. And there's a lot of questions about what will be counted, what won't be counted. There will be legal wrangling on that to go forward. There are even Republicans who are saying that that some of the ballots that maybe didn't get postmarked or didn't arrive in time should be counted. So a lot of fighting there. Now, when we take it to the broader level, this is what becomes important. The U.S. Postal Service right now is saying that they will run into just an economic wall by June, perhaps earlier, and they're asking for additional resources. Postal Service is an incredibly effective, efficient, and frankly, if you took the chains off it, potentially very profitable institution. The Postal Service is great, and yet Trump is refusing to quote unquote bail them out. It isn't a bailout; it's actually a structural move that helps our society. And
he doesn't like helping society.
I'm not seeing a lot of evidence of that of late. And but this is a big deal, because whatever Trump's motivations are, the fact of the matter is we need to supercharge the Postal Service right now. We need to make sure that the Postal Service has the resources it will need. And frankly, states have the resources to work with it, so that if the coronavirus lingers into the fall, which is possible, or if things dramatically improve, but then we have a so-called double dip where the virus returns in the fall, we could see every state in the country, and believe me, I've interviewed the epidemiologists about this, we could see every state in the country wrestling with these kinds of issues. The same thing Wisconsin went through. And you have the possibility that bad players will, in fact, try to game the process in a way that benefits them politically. And the way to get around that, is to make sure that every state has the widest number of options, including mail voting, as well as absentee voting, early voting, et cetera. To do all of that, the post office is central. And so if you want to, we can talk as we move along here about solutions, but I tell everyone the number one solution is that in the next stimulus bill, because these are negotiations between the Democrats and the Republicans and, all this wrangling in Washington. In the next stimulus bill, Democrats, progressive forces, however you want to refer to it, they have to first and foremost fight to protect frontline workers in all areas, particularly in the healthcare sector, make sure that we are safe and healthy. That's number one. Number two, because economic chaos also creates more challenges for health and safety, we have to respond to the economic chaos. But parallel to that, we also have to respond to the potential for small d democracy chaos. And the way to do that is to A, supercharge funding of the Postal Service, and B, get resources out to the states so that they can begin, and it's not hard, begin a transition to a mail absentee ballot system that is at least available for November. Democrats have to make this a, no compromise position as they negotiate with the Republicans. And the truth is they can win on
basically say, no, we can't go to vote by mail, because if we do, Republicans will lose.
Yeah, the
said that.
President has acknowledged reality. And it's a very interesting thing that,
well,
that reality's been doing very well recently. There's a lot of interest in reality. But do you know what the truth of the matter is? We don't know fully what vote by mail, how vote by mail, and it will work in every circumstance and in every state. There are some states where Republicans will do great under a vote by mail system. And there are some states where Democrats will do great. But the one thing that vote by mail does is that
paper trail.
What?
It gives you a paper trail that we've been wanting forever.
Well, that's a nice thing. I'll give you something else that's nice. More voters. It's simply, the evidence is that vote by mail and liberal absentee voting rules and early voting, all of this increases the size of the electorate. And I would argue that Donald Trump, throughout his career, has always relied, it's not even Republican votes, he relies for a core narrow sector of the Republican Party and the Republican base to protect him politically. And so I just don't think that Donald Trump wants high turnout elections.
No.
And I actually believe there are some Republicans who don't have a problem with high turnout elections. They think they can win the battle of ideas. I think Donald Trump knows he can't win the battle of ideas. And so throughout his presidency, again and again and again, his administration, long before the current fight, has been on the side of making it harder to vote. And so I really try not to reduce this to a simplistic partisan fight, because there's more to it than that. There are conservatives, there are Republicans who think that they, that they can get out there and argue and win votes.
I think all of democracy is served if we have a paper trail.
Paper trail and a lot of voters.
And a lot of voters, exactly. Yeah. John, I feel like I've kept you for a long time, but we haven't even gotten to half of what I wanted to talk to you about, which is your recent piece about your interview with Bernie Sanders. Pretty much everyone on both of our platforms are in a bit of grief over Bernie Sanders leaving the race. Mm-hmm. Your thoughts about that, your thoughts about, you spoke to him right before he ended his political run, or his presidential run at least, and you also spoke to him before his first presidential run. Can you talk about how the country's politics have changed over time and what successes you attribute for progressives to Sanders' campaign?
Well, the fact of the matter is Bernie Sanders has always been a movement politician. In fact, before he was a politician, he was a movement guy. That goes back to the 1960s. And so this is who he is. It's his personality. It's his style. When I first interviewed him about the prospect of running for president back in 2013 and 2014, he could barely, use the standard political phrases like "when I'm president" or "this is what I'll do when I'm in charge." It just wasn't. He was much more interested in the idea of advancing a host of progressive ideas that had not been at the center of the discourse. And he always said in those early days that there are these brilliant ideas being brought forward by economic and social and racial justice campaigners. There's brilliant ideas about saving the planet, about ending, our militarism and our, wars of whim. And he wanted to bring these closer to the center of at least the Democratic debate and perhaps the national debate. That's what he talked about 6 years ago. On almost every level, he helped to do that. And what he did, and this is what's so important, is he amplified and focused arguments that movements were making for a $15 wage, for single-payer Medicare for all healthcare, for free college, for criminal justice reform. He took ideas and issues that were there already and put them into an electoral context. This is huge, and we cannot begin to underestimate it. Histories will be written 100 years from now, in which I will argue that Bernie Sanders will be a far more dynamic figure, a far more important figure than many of the people who may have done better than him, in a particular election. The other thing he did was inspire a generation of young people, not just to come vote, but also to run for office. And I cannot begin to underestimate that. I interviewed him a number of times about this, including in this most recent interview. And what he said, he went again and again going to this discussion about the power of young voters and the power of young candidates. And here's, I guess, a subtlety of the thing. If Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, the congresswoman from New York who says that she was inspired to run for office by Bernie Sanders' 2016 campaign, if she waits through 10 presidential election cycles, if she waits more than 40 years, and then decides to run for president,
we'll all be dead.
What?
She better hurry it up. We'll all be dead.
I don't mind that at all. I'm saying, though, do you understand how young these people are? That if she waited through 10 election cycles, she would still be younger than Joe Biden or Bernie Sanders. Yeah. And so he brought people into prominence, or helped and encourage people to come into prominence in American politics who will be the leaders of the future. And that's what, to my mind, that's what any good campaign does. It isn't just about the moment, although, yeah, you want to win and you want to have successes. It's also about, creating something that lasts. And the fact of the matter is Bernie Sanders is in his late 70s. But so many of the people who have come into public office in this country, inspired by, encouraged by, often endorsed by Bernie Sanders, are in their 20s and 30s. That's a legacy that matters profoundly. And the final thing I'll say, too, is be careful about saying that everything's over as regards the presidential race. The fact of the matter is Bernie Sanders is still on the ballot in states. There will be a lot more elections. I expect in Wisconsin, Bernie Sanders will win some delegates. He just got 45% of the vote over the weekend in the Alaska voting.
Are you saying
And
Bernie
so
could still
the truth
win?
of the matter is that Bernie Sanders, this movement politician, has stepped out of the presidential race himself personally. He's not campaigning, but that movement continues. And I expect it's still going to get a lot of votes, a lot of delegates, and be a factor in the future of the Democratic Party.
How will it be a factor in the future of the Democratic Party?
Well, I'll tell you right off the bat. If you look,
if Biden drops out, are we going to definitely have Bernie?
No, I wouldn't suggest that.
Just wondering.
No, it's a fair wonder, and it's it's something to discuss. The fact of the matter is that I don't want to get lost in the punditry of what Biden does or what it might mean. Let me go to something that I think is deeper, and then of course you can drag me back to punditry if you want.
No, that's fine.
But here's the reality. Every vote, in my opinion, every vote that is cast for Bernie Sanders in the dozens of contests yet to come, every vote that is cast for Bernie Sanders is a vote for a Democratic Party that is supportive of single-payer health care, free college, criminal justice reform, radical reform of our foreign policies, and a commitment to save the planet in a period of climate change. And most importantly, at this moment, in the moment we're talking about, a commitment to fight against austerity when the Republicans inevitably come after we come out of the coronavirus crisis and say, oh, we've got to cut everything to pay off all the money that we spent. That's the big fight of the next couple of years, will be over austerity versus a continued investment in a fair and functional economics. Every vote for Bernie Sanders says get on the right side of that fight. I know that the Democratic Party has a history of compromise and a history of failing in moments like that. And so, you're talking about whether you build a spine and at the convention, which will probably be virtual, and going forward, you want a Democratic Party that's willing to fight harder. So I can't guarantee what will happen. That's a bigger issue, and that's for the pundits, right? But what I can guarantee is that the chance that we, the people, have a voice in those great debates about economic and social and racial justice, and also about this coming austerity battle that will be brutal, the chance that we have a voice in that and have some way of getting a humane answer, I believe lies in making sure that there is a force at the Democratic Convention, and frankly, in the Democratic Party going forward, that says we never go back to lack of planning. We never go back to the failed policies of the past that the Democratic Party, and frankly, progressive movements beyond it, because I don't want this just to be Democrats and Republicans, but that there be a force in our politics that says that we're not going to answer the problems of the future with the austerity policies and the failures that got us into a lot of the mess we're in today.
Well, John, I have a million more questions for you, but I know that I've kept you quite a bit longer than I've asked you to come on. So I appreciate you giving us the time. I hope you'll come back more frequently now that we're, a regular staple of people's progressive diets. Question.
Yeah.
Your podcast for the nation.
Yes.
Next Left, still going?
Actually, it's on hiatus in the moment. Our plan was to come back, to kind of
rest it for a few months because it was really hard work. We were, and my
Tell me about it.
What?
Oh, I know. You work harder than I always.
All day long.
My wonderful colleague, Sophia Steiner-Eboy, who really did so much of the hard work on production and that, and I, as well as Frank Reynolds at The Nation, we all chose to put it on hiatus, not because it wasn't wonderful, but because people needed time. We're in a chaotic moment right now, but Sophia and I were talking on the phone the other day about, how we take things the next step. And
well, I look forward to its return, but also in the meantime, I hope that you'll be a more regular appearance on our show, because your voice, I mean, you're writing all the time, so we can read it, but your voice and your presence is absolutely necessary to the progressive movement. So I thank you for being here. If you don't know who John is, you can follow him on Twitter at Nichols Uprising, Nichols Uprising. in the regular way it's spelled. John, final words for the political moment that we're in?
Political people, um, yeah, keep listening to programs like this. We need independent media in this period more than ever. And there have to be questioning and challenging voices. You don't have to agree with everything you hear, but what you have to understand is that we're not going to get out of this thing without a lot of information. So that's number one. To need,
Oh, you're breaking up. Wait, start again on number two.
We've seen at least since the Great Depression and its aftermath. Too frequently, we've seen compromise and we've seen failure in our politics. We can't afford that anymore. And so we need innovative and creative activism at the electoral stage, but also at the movement stage. And I guess if I would leave a final political message, it is that we need to give absolute support to our frontline workers. That includes everybody in healthcare, especially the nurses, but also the janitors, the maintenance people, everybody that keeps our hospitals and healthcare facilities running. We need to give support to the people that keep us fed, and that's farmers, grocery store people who deliver food, and I want to put a special emphasis to keep.
I hate that this is just slightly breaking up. Can you go back?
Bus drivers, subway. And the final thing I'm going to say is we need to protect the people who are keeping our transportation services functioning, the people who get doctors and nurses and delivery people and others to their jobs. And that means we have to protect people in transit. I'm vitally concerned about the many, many deaths of bus drivers, subway workers, and others. We've got to protect them. And so I support what the ATU and the TWU, our two great transportation unions, are doing, saying that if you don't get protective gear and safety protection for our transit workers, then you are failing in this vital struggle. So I'll close with support transit workers.
John, I have so many thoughts and questions for you, but is this a good time for people to strike? I mean, literally these people's lives are on the line for driving the subway.
Yeah, look, people have to get the service, they have to get the protection they need. The transportation unions have said that if they don't get the protection they need, they are going to have to stand down. They can't, send their drivers into, and their workers or maintenance people into unsafe circumstances. And I want to really emphasize, these people in these services are committed to saving lives. They want to be in the front lines and to do what is necessary, but they cannot be asked to do so at the risk of their own lives and the lives of their family. And so we have to be conscious of this. And there are circumstances where people are going to need to withdraw their services until they are protected. And that is not self-service there. I mean, that is literally saying you can't create a situation where our transportation services, as an example, are unsafe. That isn't just unsafe for drivers and maintenance workers and conductors and others. That's unsafe for the passengers. Mm-hmm. And so if we want to flatten the curve, if you're serious about this, then get the protective gear to everyone that needs it. Of course, to nurses and doctors and the people in our healthcare system. Of course, to people in our food system. But I just keep emphasizing, don't forget transit. There have been way too many deaths of bus drivers, subway conductors, and others because they went out and risked their lives on our behalf. And too frequently, even now, there are cities across this country and transportation agencies that are not providing sufficient care. It's a big deal. I've been writing about this quite a bit. It's my personal passion.
Yes. I'm a trained psychotherapist, and one of the things we always tell people to do when they're caring in positions to care for others is to, it's kind of an ironic turn of phrase at this point, is to it's like in an airline, you make sure your mask is affixed before you help others, and I think it's an apt metaphor for, an apt slogan for this time. I can't believe they would ask people to help others and risk their lives to help them just to drive the train. I get, like, if you're in the military and you risk your life to keep America safe or whatever, but this is just seems absolutely inhumane.
You're right. It's madness. And also, but I do want to emphasize, that person who drives the train, they make the whole thing work. If you can't get, into the city to work in the hospital in the city, because you rely on that train, if it's not safe to do that, then the whole thing starts to fall apart. And so we just have to step up. And this is not just a New York thing. In talking to the transit unions, people in Boston and the Seattle area, in DC, and in other cities across this country have died. In Detroit, a bus driver actually made a video about the lack of safety on the bus he was driving, and he ended up dying. He recognized the lack of safety. He spoke about it publicly, but he wasn't able to get the care and support he needed before he died. I mean, this is something as a society we can do right now. And the fact of the matter is that transit workers, as well as postal workers, tend to be people, we're.
Oh, it cut out, John.
I'm sorry. Transit workers and postal workers are people who get going often before dawn and work after dark. They go into every neighborhood. They are universal services. They don't let anybody down. They don't leave anybody behind. How can we pop them down and line?
Absolutely. Thank you so much, John. John Nichols from The Nation. We look forward to your return to this program. We look forward to your return to your own podcast, and we will be reading you as you continue to write. What's coming up next?
I have a piece on Wisconsin that'll be in the magazine this week. And then I'm writing, it's another topic altogether. We could discuss it some other time, but it's really vital. We have to get into the global fight to cancel third world debt.
I was reading your Jubilee piece. Yes, we do have to talk about that. In fact, in the middle of our interview, I just texted my assistant producer to say, get him back. So you'll be hearing from my producer. Thanks a lot, John. I really appreciate it. I feel like we've caught up now. And now that we're present, we'll go on from here.
We will, and I promise even a better internet connection next time.
Yeah, maybe it won't be like apocalyptically windy here in New York City. Who knows
Who knows, but thank you for what you're doing. It really does matter.
Thank you so much. Thanks, John. And thanks to everyone in the stream for watching. Thank you for watching on Facebook. I'm Julianna Forlano. Please tell your friends about our Facebook stream. We're on Monday through Friday from 10 a.m. to, usually it's 11:15, but through the grace of the technology, John Nichols from The Nation stayed with us an extra half an hour, which is unheard of and very gracious of him. So follow us here on Facebook. I'll be saying goodbye to the Facebook audience, and we'll be over on Twitch for like the whole day. Not just me. James is coming on after me. God knows what's happening after that. So if you want more of this kind of discussion, twitch.tv/act.tv. Goodbye, Facebook. Thank you so much. And if you're watching on YouTube, don't forget to hit the like and subscribe and watch all of our other interviews, because we're talking with people who are interesting and smart. That's the whole point of it.